I never told my son about the lake house in the Ozarks, or the $195,000 a year his mother's books still bring in. Dorothy died on a Thursday. Pancreatic cancer. We had 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctors told us was actually more time than most people get with that particular kind. I'm not sure that made it better. I'm not sure anything could have made it better. She was 64 years old, and she still had paint under her fingernails on the day she died, because she'd spent her final morning adding color to a manuscript she would never finish. My son drove up from Dallas the morning of the funeral with his wife and their 2 kids. He wore a dark suit that looked expensive. He shook my hand at the graveside instead of hugging me, which I noticed but didn't say anything about. His wife wore sunglasses even though it was overcast, and spent most of the service on her phone. I watched my son stare at the casket with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not grief, exactly. Something more calculating than grief. Dorothy had seen it clearly. I had loved my son too much to see it until she was gone. They stayed that first night in a hotel, which I thought was strange. We had 2 extra bedrooms, and they knew that. But my son said the kids needed their routines, and I didn't argue. I was too tired to argue about anything. I sat in Dorothy's studio after everyone left and looked at her half-finished watercolor on the easel and tried to figure out how a person was supposed to exist in a world that no longer contained her. The answer, it turned out, was that you didn't have to figure it out alone. Dorothy had already figured it out for you, but I didn't know that yet. My son came back the next morning with his wife and a man I didn't recognize. The stranger wore khakis and a blue blazer and carried a leather portfolio under his arm. He introduced himself as a real estate consultant who specialized in estate transitions. Estate transitions. That was what he called it. Dorothy had been in the ground for 18 hours. I stood in my own kitchen and watched my son set 3 mugs on the counter like he owned the place, and I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the November air coming through the gaps in the window frame. "Dad," my son said, "we've been talking, and we think the most practical thing right now is to get you out from under this house. It's 4 bedrooms. The backyard alone is a maintenance nightmare. Property taxes in this neighborhood have been going up every year. Honestly, with everything you're going through, the last thing you need is to be worrying about gutters and furnaces and all of it." His wife nodded from across the counter, stirring her coffee slowly. She had very precise movements, his wife. Everything calculated. She said, "We found a wonderful senior living community out in Broken Arrow. Independent living, not assisted, so you'd still have your privacy. But you'd have people around. Support. It would really put our minds at ease." Our minds at ease. The real estate consultant opened his portfolio on my kitchen table without asking. He had comps from the neighborhood. He had projections. He had a glossy photograph of a similar home that had sold 2 months ago for just over $900,000. He smiled at me the way people smile at someone they're not sure is fully following the conversation. "Mr. Patterson, in a market like this, a property like yours moves fast. We could have an offer in 2 weeks. Easily. Maybe less. You could be liquid before Christmas." I looked at the papers spread across the table that Dorothy and I had bought at an estate sale in 1991. I looked at the kitchen where she had illustrated 23 children's books, where our granddaughter had learned to make biscuits, where we had eaten 10,000 ordinary meals that I would give almost anything to eat one more time. "I need some time," I said. My son leaned forward. "Dad, we don't have a lot of time. These things need to be handled while the market is right, while you still have options." He paused and then added, more gently, "Mom would want you to be taken care of." I said I needed time. They left before noon. That evening, I went into Dorothy's studio and opened the flat file cabinet where she kept her finished work. Behind the 3rd drawer, tucked into a manila envelope with my name on it in her handwriting, I found the letter. She had beautiful handwriting, careful and small. She'd always said her handwriting was the one thing she'd gotten from her mother that she was grateful for. "Frank," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the cancer one. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I really thought we'd have more time. I thought we'd have the lake house summers and the drive down to see the bluebonnets in the spring and all the rest of it. I wanted more time. I didn't get it, and I'm sorrier for that than I can put into words. But I need you to listen to me now, because I know our son, and I know what he's going to do, and I need you to be ready. I read the letter twice before I turned the page. Then I read it 3 more times after that. At the bottom, she had written a phone number. She had written, "His name is James Whitfield. He's in Stillwater. He's been expecting your call for almost 2 years. Tell him Dorothy's husband finally read the letter." I called that night. A man answered on the second ring, despite the hour. He said, "I've been wondering when you'd call. I'm so very sorry about Dorothy. She was one of the most methodical people I've ever worked with, and that is saying something." "Methodical," I said. "She came to see me 22 months ago," he said. "She said she wasn't sick yet, but she wanted to be prepared. She said she had a feeling about how things would go when she was gone, and she wanted to make sure you were protected before that happened. 22 months ago, she hadn't said a word to me about any of it. 22 months ago, we had been driving to Arkansas to see the fall leaves, and she had been reading me passages from a novel she loved, and we had stopped at a roadside stand and bought 4 jars of honey from a man with a white beard, and I had had absolutely no idea that somewhere in her mind she was quietly building a wall between me and the future she could already see coming. "She told me about the house in Missouri," James Whitfield said. "She told me about the royalty situation. She wanted everything structured so that your son would have no legal claim to either one. It took a few months to get it all in order, but it's airtight. She was very specific about what she wanted." I sat in the dark kitchen for a long time after we hung up. Dorothy had grown up on a lake in the Missouri Ozarks. Her parents had owned a small piece of land there with a cabin on it, and when her mother died, she had inherited it. She never sold it. She never talked about selling it. Every few years, we'd drive up and spend a week, and she'd sit on the dock in the early mornings and watch the light come across the water with an expression of such pure contentment that it made me feel like I was seeing something private, something almost sacred. Our son had gone once, when he was 11. He'd complained about the lack of cable television and the fact that the nearest pizza place was 40 minutes away. He never went back. Dorothy had spent the last several years renovating the cabin quietly, a little at a time. New plumbing, a real kitchen, a wood-burning stove in the main room, a studio space with north-facing windows and good light. She had done it all without mentioning it much, and I had assumed it was just one of her projects, the way the garden was a project and her book work was a project. I hadn't understood that she was building us somewhere to go. My son came back 3 days later. This time he brought his wife and a different man, a financial advisor with a business card that listed 4 different credentials after his name. They sat in my living room, and my son talked about liquidity and asset consolidation and the importance of having professional management over my finances, given my age and my recent loss. He said, "Given my age and my recent loss," as though these were things happening to someone else. As though he were a concerned observer and not a 42-year-old man sitting in his dead mother's living room within a week of her funeral, trying to get his hands on the deed to her house. His wife had brought a binder. She opened it on the coffee table and walked me through it with the focused energy of someone who had rehearsed this presentation. There were sections on senior living options, sections on estate planning, a section on a special financial account that my son and his wife would manage jointly on my behalf. The account already had a name on it. I said, "Where did you get the information to put this together?" His wife looked up from the binder. "Oh, we've been working on this for a while. We wanted to be ready so we could really help you when the time came." A while. Before Dorothy had even died, they'd been working on this. I thought about that and kept my face very still. "I'll think about it," I said. My son slid a packet of papers across the coffee table. "Just a power of attorney," he said. "Standard stuff. It would let me manage the sale of the house and make sure the money goes somewhere safe. You wouldn't have to deal with any of it. We'd handle everything." The financial advisor smiled and said, "At this stage in life, having professional management of your assets is really just good common sense." I was 67 years old. I had worked as a mechanical engineer for 38 years. I had built 2 engines from scratch in my garage as hobbies. I had a master's degree. I had managed my own finances since I was 19. I said I would think about the papers and ask them to leave. That night, my granddaughter called. She was my son's daughter, 20 years old, a sophomore at the University of Oklahoma studying studio art. She had gotten Dorothy's cheekbones and Dorothy's habit of going very quiet when she was working something out. Her father thought her degree was a waste of time and money. He said this to her regularly and without apparent awareness of how much it cost her to hear it. "Grandpa," she said, "Dad told me you're selling the house and moving to Broken Arrow. Is that what you want?" I said I was still thinking. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom has been on the phone with realtors." I heard her. She's been calling them for over a week. Over a week. Dorothy had been alive over a week ago. I said, "Your grandmother left me something I need to tell you about. Can you come over this weekend?" She said she could. She arrived Saturday afternoon with a duffel bag and a portfolio of new paintings and the particular lightness she always had when she got out of her parents' house in Dallas and came north. She had her grandmother's way of moving through a space, taking everything in without rushing. She stood in the doorway of Dorothy's studio for a long time without saying anything. We made tea the way Dorothy had always made it, loose leaf in the old ceramic pot, and sat at the kitchen table, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. That was also a thing she shared with her grandmother. She could listen the way most people couldn't, actually receiving what was being said instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. When I was done, she said, "The lake house. I remember Grandma talking about it. She said she used to go there as a kid. She said the light in the mornings was the best light she'd ever seen." Dorothy had described it to her almost exactly the way she described it to me when we first met. That made my throat tight in a way I hadn't expected. I said, "I could use some help. I don't know anything about running a cabin or managing a property like that, and I'm going to be learning everything from scratch. I have enough to pay you fairly and you'd have time to paint. Actually paint. Not just coursework." She looked at the table for a moment. "Dad would not be happy about this." "No," I agreed. "He wouldn't." She looked up with a small smile that was entirely her grandmother's. "I'm in," she said. My son called that Sunday evening. His wife was on the extension, which I could tell by the slight echo. He said, "Dad, Ashley can list the house this week. We need to get moving. There's an offer in the neighborhood already, and we don't want to miss the window." I said, "I've made a decision. I'm not selling." The silence on the other end was the kind of silence that has a shape to it. Then he said, "What do you mean you're not selling?" I said I was moving to Missouri, to the lake house Dorothy had left me. He said, "What lake house?" "Mom didn't have a lake house." "She had a lot of things you didn't know about," I said. His voice shifted into a register I hadn't heard since he was a teenager trying to negotiate a later curfew. He said, "Dad, listen to me. You're grieving. You're not thinking straight. You're 67 years old and you want to move to some cabin in Missouri alone? That doesn't make any sense. This is not rational behavior." His wife said, "We're just worried about you, Frank. This is not the time to make major decisions." I said my decision was made. I said I'd be in touch. I hung up. He called back within the hour. He said, "I talked to a doctor, a specialist in elder care. He thinks it would be a good idea for you to come in for an evaluation, just to make sure everything is okay cognitively. It's routine after a major loss. It's nothing to be embarrassed about." He said it's nothing to be embarrassed about the way you'd say it to someone who had every reason to be embarrassed. I said I hadn't agreed to any evaluation. He said, "Dad, if you won't do this voluntarily, I may have no choice but to pursue guardianship. I'm your son. I'm responsible for your well-being." He said he was responsible for my well-being. The next morning I called James Whitfield. "They're moving toward guardianship," I told him. He said, "Let them. They won't get it. You're competent. You're lucid. You haven't done anything irrational. A judge would laugh it out of court. But they don't know that yet, and their lawyer apparently doesn't know what he's doing." He paused and said, "Are you ready to move forward with what Dorothy planned?" I looked out the window at the backyard. Dorothy's raised garden beds, the bird feeders she'd filled every week, the oak tree we'd planted when we moved in that was now taller than the house. There were 33 years of our life in this yard, and I was going to leave all of it, and for one moment that felt impossible. Then I thought about her voice reading to me in the car on the way to Arkansas. I thought about her hands on a coffee mug in the early morning. I thought about her sitting on that dock, watching the light come across the water. I said, yes, I'm ready. He told me the rest of what Dorothy had arranged. I listened for a long time without speaking. When he was finished, I sat with it for a while, turning it over the way you'd turn over something you found on the ground that you weren't sure yet was valuable or just a rock. Then I said, she was extraordinary. James Whitfield said, she was the most prepared client I've ever had, and I've been doing this for 30 years. He explained about the Tulsa house. Dorothy had noticed a letter from the city in our mail 3 years ago, something about a rezoning study. She'd done her own research, which was the thing about Dorothy. She never let a thing go uninvestigated once it had caught her attention. She'd found a city environmental report, a preliminary assessment from the EPA about a former industrial site 2 blocks east of our neighborhood. The contamination hadn't reached our property, and likely wouldn't, but the designation was going to affect home values throughout the area significantly once it became public. The report had been finalized and would be published in the next 60 days. There was more. Dorothy had hired a structural engineer. The soil in our part of Tulsa was notoriously difficult. Expansive clay that shifted with moisture changes, and our house had been showing subtle signs of foundation stress for years. Nothing catastrophic, but enough that a thorough inspection would flag it. A full remediation would cost between $250,000 and $300,000, conservatively. She had also discovered, buried in the fine print of our HOA agreement, a provision for a special assessment for neighborhood infrastructure that had been quietly deferred for years. The assessment had finally been triggered. Each property owner in our section would owe $68,000, payable within 8 months. Dorothy had assembled all of this into a folder that James Whitfield had held in a filing cabinet for almost 2 years, waiting for a phone call I finally made. She didn't tell me any of it, I said. She said she didn't want to worry you, he said. She said you had a tendency to try to fix things, and she didn't want you spending your retirement savings on a house that wasn't worth saving. She wanted you to have a clean exit. A clean exit. She had been planning my clean exit while she was still healthy enough to go to Arkansas and read to me in the car. My son arrived the following Tuesday morning with his wife and their family's attorney. The attorney was a compact man with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, who set his briefcase on my kitchen table with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this regularly. He said he was there to facilitate a process that was really in everyone's best interest, given the circumstances. His wife had brought flowers and set them in a vase without asking where things were kept. She had been in my kitchen enough times to know where things were kept. She moved through it with a proprietary ease that I had noticed before but never named. My son said, "Dad, we're not trying to fight with you. We love you. We want what's best for you. And what's best for you is to not be carrying a property of this size alone at your age after everything you've just been through. Let us help you." He said, "Let us help you the way people say it when what they mean is let us take over." I said, "I've been thinking about what you said, and I think you're right that I can't manage this house alone." I said I'd been doing some reflection, and I'd realized I was being stubborn and it wasn't fair to them. My son's expression changed. Something in him relaxed that had been braced for a fight. I said, "I'm not going to sell the house. I want to give it to you instead, as an early inheritance. The whole thing, free and clear, no strings." His wife looked at my son. My son looked at me. He said, "Give it to us." I said, "Your mother and I bought this house when you were 8 years old. You grew up here. It should stay in the family. I don't want to deal with a sale. I don't want agents and open houses and negotiations. I want to hand it to you and be done with it and know it's in good hands." His wife said, "Frank, are you serious?" I said I was completely serious. I said James Whitfield had already drawn up the transfer papers. My son read them twice, very carefully, looking for something I'd hidden inside the language. There was nothing to find. It was a straightforward property transfer, the house and the lot, all of it going to my son outright with no conditions and no encumbrances. The attorney reviewed them and said everything appeared to be in order. His wife said, What about you? Where will you live? I said I had Dorothy's life insurance, which was enough for a small rental apartment while I figured things out. I said I'd be fine. I said I just wanted them to have what they'd always wanted. My son signed. His wife signed. The attorney witnessed it. They moved through the paperwork with a speed that told me they'd been afraid I'd change my mind, that the whole time they'd been braced for a catch that never arrived. They filed the paperwork the same day. That evening, my granddaughter came over and helped me pack. We worked until midnight, pulling books off shelves and wrapping the dishes Dorothy had painted by hand and rolling up the rugs and labeling boxes with a black marker. My granddaughter had put music on low on her phone, and we worked quietly, and the house began to look like what it was, a place we were leaving. I found one of Dorothy's sketchbooks in the studio, tucked behind a set of reference books. I sat on the floor and went through it. There were thumbnail sketches for book illustrations, studies of birds and flowers and children's faces, and then in the back, a series of drawings I hadn't seen before. The lake, the dock, the light on the water in different conditions, morning and evening and overcast and brilliant. She had been drawing it from memory, returning to it again and again, working out some vision she'd been carrying around. She'd been homesick for a place she'd always planned to go back to. My granddaughter sat down beside me on the floor and looked at the drawings. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "We should put these up when we get there." "We should," I agreed. The drive to Missouri took 9 hours with stops. My granddaughter drove the first half while I read to her from a novel Dorothy had recommended months ago that I'd kept putting off starting. We stopped for lunch in Joplin and ate at a diner where the coffee was good and the pie was better. And my granddaughter told me about the series of paintings she wanted to work on. Large landscapes, she thought. Large enough that you had to step back to see the whole thing. I told her about the north-facing windows in the studio Dorothy had built. Her face changed when I described them. The particular aliveness that came over her when she was imagining making something. She looked the way Dorothy had looked, talking about a new project. I didn't say that out loud. The cabin sat on 4 acres, at the end of a gravel road, above a small cove where the water was very still in the mornings. Dorothy had not understated the light. I had forgotten what it was like, those early visits years ago, and now standing on the dock at 6:30 in the morning, the day after we arrived, I understood why she had kept drawing it from memory. It was the kind of light that made you believe time was moving at the right speed again. The cabin itself was more than I had expected. Dorothy's renovations had been thorough and careful. The kitchen was small, but well designed. The main room had the wood stove and a good sofa and her books already on the shelves, transported ahead of us in a separate shipment James Whitfield had arranged on her instructions. The studio had the north windows and a long work table and built-in storage and a wall of pegboard for hanging work. She had put a small framed photograph on the windowsill. The two of us, young, standing in front of this cabin 20-something years ago, both of us squinting into the sun. She'd had it printed and framed and put it here, waiting. I stood in that room for a long time. My granddaughter set up her corner of the studio within the first 2 days, organizing her brushes and paints with the quiet intensity she brought to any system she cared about. She started painting the 3rd morning, standing at the window with a cup of coffee and then putting the cup down and picking up a brush without ceremony, as though she'd been doing it here for years. The nearest town was 20 minutes away. Small, old, friendly in the way of places that haven't been discovered yet. The neighbors on either side came over with food and introductions within the first week. A retired school teacher to the north and a couple who ran a small orchard to the south. Dorothy had known them. She'd kept in touch over the years, apparently, cards and occasional calls. They spoke of her with the easy warmth of people who had known her before she was Mrs. Patterson, when she was just Dorothy from the Ozarks who moved away and made good and never forgot where she came from. I took long walks in the mornings. I talked to Dorothy out loud, which I had felt self-conscious about at first, and then stopped feeling self-conscious about. I told her about the cabin, about the light, about what her granddaughter was painting. I told her she'd been right about everything, which she had been, which she almost always was, which was one of the things about her that had made living alongside her both wonderful and occasionally very humbling. Dorothy's books were used in elementary school curricula in 14 states. 12 titles still in print, several of them approaching their 30th anniversary editions with no sign of slowing down. The royalty payment arrived in the first week of January, direct deposit, $195,000 that landed in my account as quietly as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. To Dorothy, it had been ordinary. She had earned it across 40 years of work, early mornings and late nights, and the accumulated discipline of someone who treated her art like a profession rather than a hobby. Her books were in libraries and classrooms, and doctors' offices and pediatric waiting rooms across the country. Children who had grown up with her work were now reading it to their own children. The royalties would continue for as long as anyone taught her books, which her publisher told me would likely be for the rest of my life and beyond. She had worked all those years and never mentioned the scale of what she was building. And I had let myself assume it was a nice supplement to our retirement, rather than what it actually was, which was everything we needed and then some. I had underestimated her consistently and spectacularly for 41 years. I had loved her well, I thought, but I had not always understood her completely. She had been, in some ways, several steps ahead of me the entire time. My son called on a Saturday morning in late February, 3 months after we'd left Tulsa. My granddaughter was in the studio. I could hear the soft sounds of her working, brush on canvas, the occasional scrape of a palette knife. The lake was flat and still outside the window, silver in the overcast light. He said, "Dad, we need to talk." I said, "Good morning." He said, his voice tight with something he was trying to contain. "The EPA has designated the area around our house as an environmental impact zone. It's going to be all over the news. Property values in the entire neighborhood are going to tank. The real estate agent says we've already lost 30% of the assessed value and it could go lower." I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." "That's not all," he said. "There's a structural issue with the foundation. We had someone look at it after we noticed some cracks. The repair estimate is $280,000, and the HOA sent us a special assessment notice, $68,000, due in 6 months." I said, "Oh my, you knew," he said. His voice had dropped to something quiet and controlled that was more frightening than shouting. "You knew about all of this, and you gave us that house anyway." "I didn't know all the details," I said. "Your mother handled a lot of things I wasn't aware of. I just knew it was getting to be too much for me to manage." "She set you up," he said. "She set this whole thing up. You gave us a disaster and then disappeared to some cabin in the middle of nowhere. Where did you even get the money for a cabin? Mom's life insurance isn't enough for a property like that." "Your mother owned the cabin before we were married," I said. "It came from her family. And the life insurance money, that's mine," I said. "As is everything else your mother left me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You knew exactly what you were doing, you and your lawyer. You deliberately gave us a property that was falling apart to get us out of your way." I said, "The house was transferred to you as a gift. That's documented. Everything was done correctly and above board. I'd encourage you to speak with your attorney." "I'm going to sue you," he said. "I'm going to take you to court, and I'm going to prove that this was fraud, and I'm going to get everything back." I said I understood that he was angry. I said I genuinely hoped he would find a path forward. I said I was going to let him go now because I had plans for the morning. He hung up. He called back twice over the following 10 days. I answered the first time. He was louder and less controlled than the first call, which told me he'd looked into the legal options and found them less promising than he'd hoped. I listened for a while and then said I was going to go. He said things I won't repeat. I hung up. The second call, I let go to voicemail. The message was 12 minutes long. I deleted it without listening to the end. Through my granddaughter, who spoke with her parents occasionally and relayed what she thought I needed to know, I learned that they had listed the house immediately, before any repairs, hoping to get ahead of the news cycle. The news cycle moved faster than the listing. The offers that came in were insultingly low. They pulled the listing and looked into financing for the foundation repair. The bank wouldn't lend against a property with active structural issues and environmental adjacency concerns. They went back to the low offers. Eventually, they accepted one from a developer who specialized in teardowns, a figure that, after the HOA assessment and the legal fees from my son's failed attempt to pursue fraud charges, left them with less than the land had been worth before Dorothy died. Everything we had built in that house, the raised beds and the oak tree and the kitchen table in the 33 years, my son had torn it down himself, chasing a number on a piece of paper. The developer came in with heavy equipment 6 weeks after the sale closed. A neighbor sent me a photograph by accident, thinking he was texting someone else. I looked at it once and then put my phone down and walked out to the dock and stood there until the light changed. My granddaughter finished her first large format series in March. 7 paintings, each one 4 feet across, each one a different hour of light on the water. She photographed them and sent the photos to 3 galleries, and the second one wrote back within a week. They offered her a small group show in their summer exhibition, her first professional showing. She called me from the studio, and I could hear in her voice the exact quality of disbelief and joy that Dorothy had described, feeling the first time a publisher said yes. I called James Whitfield that evening to let him know things were settled. He said Dorothy would be pleased. I said I thought she would be, and also I thought she had probably already known it would go this way, which made him laugh. I cooked dinner for my granddaughter that night. Dorothy's chicken and rice recipe from the index card in her handwriting that I'd tucked into my bag before we left Tulsa. My granddaughter set the table and lit a candle, and we ate with the studio door open so we could hear the water. She told me about the gallery, about the other artists in the show, about a project she was already planning for the fall. She talked about Dorothy easily, remembering stories, asking questions about things she'd never thought to ask when there was still time. After dinner, she said, "Do you think Grandma knew I'd end up here? Like, specifically?" I thought about the sketchbook, the drawings of the light across the water, done from memory in the back of the studio, refined over and over again. The photograph on the windowsill, already framed, already waiting. "I think she knew a lot of things she kept to herself," I said. My granddaughter smiled and said, "That sounded exactly right." I started writing in April. I'd kept notes for years, the habit of an engineer, and I had files on my laptop full of half-formed observations about 40 years of work and the particular education you get from watching things break down and figuring out how to rebuild them. I didn't know if it was a book. I didn't know if it was anything, but I wrote in the mornings before my walk, 2 or 3 hours at the kitchen table while my granddaughter slept, and slowly something began to take shape that I couldn't have named at the start. My son never called again after the second voicemail. I thought about reaching out. I sat with the thought a few times, turning it over, examining it honestly. I did not reach out. He had made choices with full information about who I was and what I wanted. He had looked at his mother's death and seen a transaction to complete. He had brought a stranger with a real estate portfolio into my house before she was cold. He had threatened to have me declared incompetent. He had tried to take control of everything Dorothy and I had built together, and when he hadn't been able to, he'd found a way to destroy it instead. These were not things that an apology on my part could repair. These were not things that were mine to repair. Dorothy had understood this before I did. Dorothy had loved her son and known him clearly, without the distortions that made it harder for me. She had not hated him. She had not wanted him to suffer. But she had been clear-eyed about what he was willing to do, and she had built her plan accordingly. She had given me freedom. That was what she had given me. Not just the cabin or the money, though I was grateful for both. She had given me permission to stop carrying the weight of a relationship that had been unequal for a long time, where I had been giving something that was never going to be returned in kind, where I had kept making room in myself for a version of my son that existed more in my hope for him than in reality. I had spent 67 years being someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. I had been responsible and present and careful, and I had tried, genuinely tried, to do right by the people who needed me to. I did not regret any of it, but there was something on the other side of all that responsibility that I hadn't expected to find, which was a quiet and startling lightness, the sensation of carrying only what was actually mine. On the first Saturday in May, my granddaughter and I took the canoe out early and paddled to the far end of the cove where the herons nested. We stayed very still in the water, and watched one of them stand motionless in the shallows, for so long it might have been a sculpture, and then move with sudden blinding precision and come up with something silver in its beak. My granddaughter said, softly so as not to startle it, "Grandma would have painted this." "She would have," I said. We floated in the cove for a while without talking. The light was doing the thing Dorothy had drawn over and over again, that particular quality of the morning reflection, the way the color seemed to come up from inside the water rather than down from the sky. I had looked at her drawings enough times by now that I could almost see what she was reaching for, the thing she kept returning to and trying to get right. I thought about the last line of her letter. She had closed it the way she closed everything she wrote to me, with the shorthand we'd developed over 41 years. 2 words that had meant more things than I could list in one place. 2 words that meant I see you and I trust you and I'm glad we found each other, and whatever comes next, I'm not afraid. She had written those 2 words, knowing I would read them alone in a quiet house on a night when the world felt catastrophically different than it had before. And she had been right that I would need them, and she had been right that they would be enough. I sat in the canoe in the light on the water and said them out loud. My granddaughter looked at me. I was not trying to explain, and she was not asking. She understood, the way she understood most things, by going quiet and making room for it. The heron spread its wings and lifted from the water without effort, and we watched it carry itself over the tree line and disappear into the blue and green morning.